Hey there, thanks very much for coming in today to talk a little bit more about assessment. We're going to talk a little bit now about the types of assessment teachers use in the classroom. Based on your experience, what are some of the common ways that teachers might use assessment in the classroom?
Well, teachers very often use questioning as a form of assessment. Now, this can be oral questioning, where they might ask students questions to assess how they do. It could be used to engage the learners, maybe before a reading or a listening task, or at the end of a reading or listening task. And at the same time, there's written questions as well, which teachers can use to see how well the students' writing and reading skills, how good their writing and reading skills are.
I suppose depending if the teacher would decide whether to have oral questions or written questions, depending on the task or depending on what they wanted, what evidence they wanted of that student learning, perhaps.
Absolutely. And in addition to that, there's different types of assessment methods, like self-assessment and peer assessment that teachers can use as well. So these can be used to for students to actually raise their awareness of how well they perform in terms of practical skills like writing or speaking.
Okay, all right. Well, let's talk a little bit more about questioning, especially oral questioning of teachers. I guess that's probably one of the most common types of questioning.
Yes, and basically there are, again, different types of oral questions. You have open questions and you have closed questions. Now, closed questions would be where the response might be a yes or no response. However, they're not really a very effective assessment method because a student might say yes or no, but they might not have understood the question. So with an open question where they have to produce the language, you can really get a much better understanding of have they understood or not. Really.
And I'm thinking back to when I was teaching, and I was a young teacher, that I'd sometimes ask a question, but the intonation in my voice would suggest that the answer would be a yes. So I'd say, so is this a blah? And I'd say yes, and I'd assume that everybody had got this just because the intonation kind of led students to the answer, and that would be an example of a really poor closed question.
Yes, and that's why you need to be very, very careful. And I think for new teachers, it's a very good idea maybe to even make a few notes, like the kind of questions you're going to ask. So if you're thinking about concept check questions to check that students have understood something that you've taught, you might want to write them down in your lesson plan.
Okay, yeah. And some people like to choose students randomly to ask questions. Some people like go around the class left to right. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, if you go around left to right, the students know which question they're going to be asked. If, like, for example, if you've got a reading comprehension, there are 10 questions, and you start off with the first person on the left, and you go around like that, the person who's sitting in the third seat on the left will know that they've got the question number 3. So that's not a good idea. And also,
so I guess the students just tune out or they start worrying about their own question.
Exactly. And the other thing is there is very often, once you've answered your question, you think you're not going to be asked again, so you'll switch off. Whereas if you ask questions, you select students. You can also choose questions based on the student's abilities. So you can ask, the more able students, more challenging questions. That way you're keeping all the students, on their toes. They don't know if they're going to be asked, when they're going to be asked, it's a much more effective way.
It seems that it's quite inclusive as well and can support differentiation if you're then choosing questions for a certain level.
Exactly, yes.
And in the past, some people have talked about the hands-up method. They say that asking and questioning, getting the student to put their hands up for an answer isn't necessarily a good way to do it either.
No, I think the teacher should very often decide on who they're going to ask that question to, because the people who put their hands up are the people who know the answers, and sometimes they can be also the more confident students. Whereas it is actually quite good to see those people that might seem a little uncertain, to ask them and see what difficulties they're having. And maybe they're not having any difficulties, but some of the quieter students don't get to answer questions because they don't put their hands up.
And so it would be a nice way to just draw them into the class and just make them feel more involved, while also, I suppose, their response and how they respond will give you some really important formative assessment information about what you need to work on.
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
And another possibility is you actually, you can actually ask one student a question and get them to choose another student to answer the following question, which is a nice, fun, alternative way. I wouldn't do that all the time, but it's
a technique you'd have.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and we can use written questions as well, or teachers can use written questions. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, I mean, teachers use written questions to get an idea of how each individual student in the class is doing. So with an oral question, you're asking one student and you're getting one response. That's very often the case. But with written questions, you can get responses from all students. So you can give them one question, have it on slips of paper, and you can see what the response is from each individual student. You can also ask students to write their own questions for each other, so you can get them to produce quizzes, and this is a good way to see how much students have understood. You can not only see how well they've understood from the answers, but you'll get a good indication of how much they've understood from the questions that they've composed. Okay, that's quite nice.
And I guess you could have a mix of kind of spoken and written. Maybe if they've got like mini whiteboards, and the teacher could ask a question, and they can write down their answers and show every student has a mini whiteboard, or on a bit of paper even, just hold up a written answer.
That's a really, really effective way of doing it. I mean, you get immediate feedback, and you can see what every single student thinks.
And as other techniques I know that teachers have used for written questioning is maybe at the end of a lesson, a teacher will ask the students to write down the answers to a couple of key questions, and the answers to those questions will essentially be feedback on what they've learned, or they might also perhaps have a question: what was the main point from the lesson, or what do you think the learning objective was, and collecting that written feedback at the end can inform the teacher on how well the students have learned that. I mean, is that something you've used, or you've seen?
I mean, a common method used in classes is the 1 minute paper, where the teacher might ask a couple of questions where to check learning, and students write them down. They've got a minute to write down the answers to certain questions. But this is not just feedback, it can also be feeding forward. So you ask a question, so what did you find difficult, what would you like to do again, what would you like to learn in the next lesson? And that's another way of using questioning.
Okay, 1 minute paper,
that's right.
That's cool. So I guess because it just takes 1 minute to do at the end of a lesson.
Yes, so you assign 1 minute, you give them a couple of questions, and you give them a minute to answer those questions. And depending on what you want to achieve, you can have it anonymous, so you can have students write their names down, but it's totally up to you.
You also mentioned student-centered assessments, and let's go for peer assessment first. Tell us a little bit about why you would have peer assessment, or how you might use it.
Well, peer assessment is a really, really effective tool to get students to, peer and self-assessment, to get students to reflect and think about their own writing. And with peer assessment, they're actually looking at somebody else's writing. Now, I know teachers who have used peer assessment and it hasn't worked so well, but this is really down to how you set it up. It is really important when you're doing peer assessment that you make it very, very clear to the students. You train them, and you make it very clear what you want to achieve and why they're doing this. Some students are very reluctant to show their work to another student. So you've got to show them, give them an example, and say, look, how would you feel if you got this feedback from the student? And you've got to also say, look, you've got to be honest. You can't just say good things. You've also got to be, you're trying to help the other person, so you've got to look at areas for improvement. Now, there are a number of different ways that you can do this. You can get students to identify 3 good points and 1 point that they need to improve. Or you can have a series of questions. So, for example, I sometimes use a peer assessment form and have questions which the students will have to answer based on the work that they're assessing, their peers' work. And the idea is to get students to have this criteria which they familiarise themselves with, and then with time that'll be internalised, and they'll be able to think, right, this is what I need to think about.
And I suppose, as you say, it's important to have that balance, otherwise it can be demotivating. So using this kind of form perhaps, or when you assign students to do some peer assessment, say, okay, you're looking to see whether this point was used correctly, and let's say at a very basic level, you're looking to see if full stops were used correctly.
Exactly.
And then they're just looking for full stops and nothing else, rather than marking a whole piece. Don't know, if marking a whole piece, they probably wouldn't have the skills to be able to do that, so you really want to start small.
Exactly. And you guide the students, you guide them to help them identify the areas that you want. So for example, as you said, like if you're looking for full stops, you said this is what we're looking for. If we're looking for, at higher levels, it might be looking at, is the introduction an effective introduction? Were you interested? Okay, and then maybe later you can look at what techniques that person will use to have an effective introduction. But you do need to tell the students what they're looking for.
Yeah, so if that's linked to what the students are learning, then it all gets reinforced.
Absolutely. And another thing to remember is, like, I use peer assessments, for writing, and I use self-assessments for writing quite a lot, but it's not just for writing. Students do presentations, and very often I might not give them a form, I might give them post-it notes. So, for example, I'll say to them, on the yellow post-it notes, I want you to write 3 things, on each post-it note I want you to write something that you liked about that person's presentation. And for each presentation I want you to have 3 yellow post-it notes. And on the pink post-it notes I want you to have an area that you feel that person could have improved. And they write something which that could have been developed. And then the person's name is put on the board, the post-it notes are put under their name, and that person can go up and have a look at all the things that people really liked and the areas that they might need to improve.
And because there are so fewer pink there and so much more of the other colour, then it's quite a striking developmental and motivational process to get them to continue and develop their work.
Exactly.
Okay, now you also mentioned self-assessment as well. Why do self-assessment?
Well, this will help students in the future proofread their work, revise their work. They've given the criteria and how to self-assess, but the idea is you slowly reduce the number of questions that you give them, and they start having maybe their own criteria. And it could be things like, I know that very often I don't paragraph my work, and they can actually come up with their own criteria and produce their own self-assessment checklists.
So you're doing it to develop self-awareness.
Exactly.
So that hopefully out of the classroom they can then start to apply that kind of mental checklist to what they're doing and just self-develop without the need of a teacher.
Exactly. So, a lot of the students will go on to maybe study at university or go on to be writing in their jobs, and they're not going to have checklists. Not written checklists, but they'll have a mental checklist in their head, and that's what we're trying to encourage students to do.
And for something like a presentation you mentioned earlier, I'm thinking that the use of smartphones, maybe to video presentations, means that the students could also self-assess themselves, but perhaps from a third-person perspective, where they're watching themselves, and they could do something similar like that.
Exactly, and I think that is a really good tool now. It's so easy to do, to record yourself. You're not just looking at how you present, but maybe just looking at the whole thing. Did you use your visuals effectively? Did you engage the audience? So it's not just using video recordings to improve the language. It's the whole presentation.
All right, Yvonne, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Thank you.